Hey everyone, my name is Eric, and in this tutorial we're going to be taking a look at ZBrush and giving you a quick introduction to using ZBrush for modeling. We're not going to be spending a lot of time on individual tools and going over every brush under the sun and so forth. We're just going to be taking a look at a couple features and actually focusing most of our time on the new Dynamesh capabilities. It is incredible. It works and it really changes the way that I personally approach ZBrush. Now, there are a lot of tutorials out there for ZBrush. You can find them on YouTube, you can find them at Z Classroom, you can find them at the ZBrush Central. E3D has some nice DVDs that go over sculpting. I highly recommend checking those out. The reason why I'm doing this particular tutorial is I just wanted to share a method or an introduction that I found kind of works for me and works for a few of the other people that I've kind of shared this with. Myself and these other people were coming from DCC packages or digital content creation packages such as Max, Maya, and so forth. The biggest thing to remember when coming from another package and looking at ZBrush for the first time is acknowledging that it's a unique package. Don't try to use it like the other packages. It's different, and rightly so, it needs to be treated differently. And so know that you're going to have to spend some time learning it. Try not to get frustrated. The benefits are tremendous. Once you learn how to use it, the creative freedom that it gives you is just, it's through the roof. So, without further ado, just want to give you a very quick background into ZBrush. ZBrush started off as a 2.5D painting program. And what that means is that it was putting down pixels on the screen just like Photoshop, Painter, whatever. But each of these pixels had some depth information. So it was somewhere between 2D and 3D. Now, these pixels with depth gave it a unique capability of building up a painting as opposed to everything existing on a singular plane. Beyond that, they started to add 3D modeling capabilities where you could start dropping in some primitives, some imported objects, and so forth. Then they built in all these capabilities to modify those three-dimensional objects. And that's where things really started to come into its own. The 2.5D painting aspect is still useful, but it's actually a lesser used functionality of ZBrush. However, knowing that that is its origin will help avoid certain issues, certain confusions when using ZBrush. And just to demonstrate this concept really quickly, I'm just going to show you the 2.5D painting capabilities in like a minute or 2 minutes. So just a quick overview of the interface first, just to make sure that we're on the same page. At the top, some common functionality, brushes, color, and so forth. On the right hand side, a lot of view control options and display options. Beyond that, we have a docking panel which can be open and closed with this little bar here. You'll notice there's one down here at the bottom and one over here at the left. This is a common toolbar, and you can find it up here at the top. And you'll notice that when I open it up, it goes away from the side. You can dock any one of these that you want just by clicking on the little circle. And when you don't want it anymore, you just click on it and it goes away. ZBrush is very configurable. There's been some people that I've seen who are master sculptors and users of ZBrush that I didn't even recognize the package at the beginning because they started to change so many different aspects, and it can actually make a significant difference to your workflow. For us, we're novices. We don't need to worry about that. Just know that once you start using it, you can configure it to how you work. Okay. This bar right here is what's called your light box, and this is where you can find things like textures and alphas, which is basically another word for brush. Well, not really brushes, but it's similar to a brush in Photoshop, tools, and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do a very quick demonstration. So I'm going to go over to the tool here, the simple brush. I'm just going to paint in the scene. So notice how it doesn't put down a very flat color. It looks like there is some depth information there. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's there. Now I'm going to do Control Z. Now the reason why it looked how it did was because ZBrush uses something called alphas. Alphas are basically grayscale patterns that are used to filter the effect that you're putting down or filter the brush stroke. So for example, if I go with a simple fall off, like this one right here, and I paint again, notice how it has a very noticeable 3D effect. Now this is not a three-dimensional model. This is the 2.5D pixels that I was mentioning to you before. If I now start another stroke, you can see what it does. And then you can just kind of keep on trying to build up these capabilities. You can change the color and just really start to build up your painting, your sculpture, whatever it may be. Now these alphas can be far more complex. So you can see we have this pattern right here. We have things like this arrow setup. But what you can also do is you can change the type of stroke that you use. So if we went over to drag rectangle, clicked and dragged, we can put down a bunch of these onto our scene. And you can actually build up some pretty neat patterns, forms, shapes, and so forth. And basically anything that is a grayscale image can be used for this 2.5D painting. Okay, this is not what we're focusing on. What we're going to be focusing on is the actual sculpting and 3D model modification capabilities. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to Document and just do New. We're not going to save it. And from our lightbox, if it's not open, just click on it in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. We're going to move over to Dynamesh. Dynamesh is a new feature of ZBrush 4 Release 2. It is incredible. It allows you to fully explore creative character or model making. I mean, I don't really know how to say it any better. It basically cuts down on a lot of the hurdles and a lot of the problems that typically associated not only model creation, but model creation using packages such as ZBrush, Mudbox, and so forth. And what it does is it retopologizes or gives you the resolution that you need where you need it. One package that didn't succumb to this was 3D Coat, which used voxels. But the nice thing about this method in ZBrush is it keeps things moving very, very quick and responsive. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to double click on where it says Dynamesh 64. Okay, and 64 just refers to the resolution. Now the way that you get around within ZBrush is you can click and drag in empty space to rotate around the object. You can also click and drag in these areas off to the side in case you are zoomed in too far. Okay, so like if your object is occupying the entire screen, this outer ring is always there for you to use. Okay, now if you hold down Alt, click and drag, you're going to pan. If you hold down Alt, click and drag, and then release Alt, you're going to zoom in and out. Okay, so it may take a little getting used to, but you can actually really get moving once you know those tools. Okay, Now, one thing that I like to do is when you're rotating, hold down Shift, and that's going to lock you to a particular axis. So you can see how I'm like this, hold down Shift, and it snaps. By default, it's typically using the XYZ rotation. I do not like that because when you're rotating, it's going to skew the horizon a little bit. Not a big fan. So instead, I like using the Y, and then that will keep things fairly level for your sculpting purposes. Okay. One other thing that you can do is sometimes it's helpful to see the topology of a model, and you can turn it on by pressing Shift F on the keyboard or doing Poly F in the lower right hand side of the screen. Now looking at this, the topology looks really bad, looks really ugly. However, you're going to start to see the benefit of this method. Don't worry about the topology here, okay? It's kind of a radical thought because if you've done any modeling in the past, topology is everything. What these tools and what Dynamesh allows you to do is it allows you to think about topology after you've created your character. And that is the process of re-topologization. Okay, so here we have our basic mesh. Now as I move the cursor over the mesh, you'll notice that there are two dots. There's one right underneath my cursor, then there's another one on the other side of the screen. This represents symmetry. You can do symmetry within ZBrush, which is actually quite nice for fleshing out forms and characters and so forth. You can define the symmetry underneath the transform menu right down here, so you can choose which axis you want to do symmetry on. You can do all axes, you can do some of them, you can approach it in a variety of ways. So for example, if I go back over here and I just turn on Y, it's going, if I click and drag on the model, I start sculpting in that particular way. If I go back up, turn off Y, go back to X, we have a very different response. Okay, so what we're going to be doing here, you already noticed that if you click and drag on the object, you can start sculpting it. Now, sculpting in ZBrush is heavily dependent on the brushes that you choose, and so you have a lot of brushes. If you click in the upper left hand corner, you can see all of these options that you have available to you. With Dynamesh, we're going to be using very specific tools. And we're going to be taking a look at these brushes, a lot of these brushes in future tutorials, as well as painting, coloring, texturing, all these other things. But for right now, just want to get you started with sculpting characters. And so I do not claim to be a great sculptor, so be gentle with your criticisms. Okay. First thing that we want to do is on the right hand side we want to expand our geometry panel. You'll notice that Dynamesh is activated and there's a lot of settings here. Don't worry about most of those. We're just dealing with Dynamesh at the moment. Now if we go over to our brushes and do clay buildup, it's also the third one here. If we orient our model, what we want to do is we want to start building up our form. And so I'm going to start just by creating kind of like a nose. And just don't worry about things being too precise at this moment. Now you can change the brush size by using the square brackets on the keyboard, or in the upper corner or upper center part of the screen you can change the draw size. Okay, and so I'm going to change the draw size to define the lips. Now as you're building up your characters, it is helpful to have some understanding of anatomy. So for example, just knowing how the lips typically form on a person makes a huge difference as you're building up that character. And so even if you're doing cartoony characters, it helps knowing those things, because it's going to end up giving your characters a little bit more substance and a little bit more believability. And so here I'm just going to go in. Now if you hold down Alt on the keyboard, you're going to subtract, or you're going to push the mesh in. And so here I'm just going to push the eye cavity way in. And then now I'm going to give the guy a nice healthy brow. And just kind of build up some of this form. Now you can tell that this is very low resolution. Okay, inside the eyes it does not look very good. And in other areas it doesn't look too great either. So this is where Dynamesh really starts to come into its own. If we click on the poly F, notice what happened here. This turned into garbage right in there. Polygons are stretched everywhere. It's just not looking like I can sculpt this any further. If you hold down Control, click and drag an empty space, what it does is it recalculates the mesh. And so you can see it fixed a lot of those issues. And now I can go back and start sculpting again, start adding some details. So here I'm just going to add the lip. And so kind of bring the lip down, bring it, flesh that out a little bit. Now in addition to adding and subtracting, you can hold down Shift on the keyboard and smooth it out. Now in some cases that's going to be very sensitive, especially if you're working at a low resolution. And so you want to be very careful with that. ZBrush is aware of pressure sensitivity on tablets, so I highly recommend using a tablet for working with ZBrush. So here I'm just going to push the nostrils all the way back, Control and drag, so that we get a much cleaner mesh to work from. So here I'm just going to round out the lips a little bit, bring them in, push out the chin a little bit. Okay, now notice how much that's smooth. That was actually pretty bad. So I'm just going to ignore smoothing it just for a moment. Sometimes you're going to see these little artifacts. Don't worry about those. It's not that big of a deal. Okay. Alright, so let's just say that this is somewhat close to the object we want to create. And actually I'm going to push this back, bring the lip up, just so that the mouth is open a little bit. Control, click, and drag to give us Control, click, and drag, just to keep giving us polygons to use. Okay, so very, very helpful. Okay, so there we have a very basic character form, right? And so we can smooth this out, we can sculpt this up however we see fit. Okay, but what we're going to be doing now is we're actually going to start modifying the form, because say this character isn't exactly right. Alright, yes, we wanted an overweight character, but it is not looking how we anticipated. If we go up to our brush, we can isolate certain brushes by pressing the first letter in that brush. So in this case we want to do the move brush and press M on the keyboard. Then we can press the letter in the upper left hand corner to specify that particular brush. So it's an easier way of getting around. Now the move brush will allow you to move portions. It doesn't try to add or remove elements. So we can take this and we can just kind of sculpt the character around. So we can change proportions, we can scale things out, and so we can bring the eyes closer together, separate them, give them a little bit of a worried look, bring that down, and just really change how the character looks. And so here we can bring the nose up a little bit, bring it back. We can take the cheeks and just kind of bring them back, bring them down a little bit, taking the chin, bringing it up, and just really just having fun with this. I mean, it really helps with the creative process to have this kind of freedom and just moving around on the scene. Okay, so say this is much closer to the type of character that we want to create. Okay, so we have something close to the nose that we want. We have the general proportions. It's starting to look a little bit like a Disney character in terms of proportions. They love to do this angular look or this slant. And so you can continue to modify these elements, continue to sculpt things up. Now, there's going to be a point where you start running out of detail or running out of resolution. And for that, underneath Dynamesh, we're going to change the resolution to somewhere in the 150s, and then click and drag in the scene again. That's going to give us more resolution to work with. So we can now go back up to our brush, and so in this case a clay brush, and start building up the nose a little bit more, defining it a little bit more than what we had, building up the nostrils a little bit, and the area underneath the eyes. And then you just basically can start reconstructing the character that you want. And so here we're going to put an additional brow. We'll do one more up here. So he has some wrinkles. And so as you can see, it's a very quick way of building up characters. And so I'm just kind of fleshing out the cheeks a little bit. We can go down into the mouth, spending a little bit more time and attention down here. Slightly better flow into the chin area. Again, knowing how anatomy works helps in these cases. We can define what are called the nasolabial folds, which are coming down there if we want to make this character look a little bit older. And again, smooth them out. And just generally work all these elements together. And so here we're defining the jawline. And a little bit of the throat. And again, this is just a really rough method. Now, because of his apparently big cheeks, we can go in here and we can just go back to our move tool, which have our common tools or our recently used tools up here at the top. And we can start modifying this. So we can pull down the chin, control click and drag to rebuild the mesh. And this is the part that really got me excited about using Dynamesh. So here you can see I'm just pulling this in ways that you would never pull it before. You would never really do this because it just totally destroys the mesh. However, you just click and drag, and then it rebuilds it. And so this has just been such a huge difference in workflows. Previously, you would have to create what's referred to as a base mesh. And that base mesh would then be, that's kind of like a creepy, weird looking character. But that base mesh would then be used to sculpt. And if you didn't know your form at that time, you'd kind of be out of luck. And so with this active, with this new geometry, you can start to build up other areas, so such as like the shoulders. You can build up the neck a little bit, drop those in, however you want to do it. That area right there isn't very good, but you can just continue to build up this character into whatever you want them to look like. Okay, so now what we're going to end up doing is we're going to be taking a look at inserting meshes and, just kind of fleshing out this character a little bit more and turning him into the final character that we actually want. Okay, so from here, what we can do is we may want to modify the eyes a little bit. Okay, now ZBrush has something called Mesh Insertion. Mesh Insertion is a pretty nice way of inserting models into an existing mesh. So if we go up to our brush and go into the insert, you can see we have cubes, cylinders, ears, hands, so on and so forth. We're going to go to sphere. And in our eye sockets, we're going to click and drag up to get the eyes roughly the size that we want. Now, as soon as we release the left mouse button, it darkens everything else. What it did was it masked everything else. And if we go back to, say, our clay build-up tools, you'll notice that it only modifies the spheres. If we hold down Control and just click in the viewport, you'll notice that it switched it. So now the eyes are dark, but everything else can be sculpted. And so this is going to give you the opportunity to, say, manipulate. So if we go over to Move, to manipulate your character and to make sure that the eye socket is exactly how you want it to be. So we can drag this up, move these out, move this back, move this brow back a little bit, move it in. Now sometimes you're going to notice little artifacts like this. Just do a little jiggle to correct it. Okay, so we can pull it forward a little bit. We may want to bring the brows down, bring them forward a little bit. Look at it from the top view. Make sure that we got nice rounded brows. Again, bring them down a little bit, just to make sure that you get the shape that you're going for this particular character. Okay, now say you have the eyes, or the shape of the eyes, how you want them to look. So I'm going to bring that up just a little bit. Actually, no. Okay, so say you have that exactly how you want them to look. If you hold down Control and just click and drag in the empty space, it's going to deselect your mask or remove your mask. If you go and do that again, you'll notice that it reconstructs the Dynamesh. This is not necessarily what we want. Notice how it smoothed everything out. This is because it reconstructed or recreated a totally new mesh based on everything that's been involved. If we do Control Z and turn on groups and do Control click and drag, it rebuilt the Dynamesh again. However, this time it preserved the hard edges. And the reason for this is if you go to your polyframe view, you'll notice that we have objects of slightly different colors. And so it tried to preserve those groups and tried to keep those things separate. Okay? Alright, so just keep that in mind. If you want to ever go back to these things and modify them afterwards, be sure to keep groups on so it preserves those. Another useful technique is to use masks in interesting ways. So if we hold down Control and Shift and click on the object that we want to see, or the object that we want to isolate, we can now do Control and drag over all objects. Pressing, and that's going to mask all objects. So if we hold down Control and Shift and click in the empty space, oops, come on, there we go. It'll bring everything back with what you had previously had masked. So you can go back to modifying things. Now you can also paint masks. And painting masks is extremely useful, especially in tight areas like say around the mouth and so forth. So if we change our brush method to standard, and if we change our brush to something a little more reasonable, hold down Control and then just paint on your object. So you can do this in a couple ways. So I'm just going to paint the lower lip here in jaw area. Now with that, we can now go over to say our move tool again, increase the brush size, and now it's only modifying that upper lip. So it's not changing the lower lip anymore. Okay, which is great if you want to pose it. Now, if you hold down Control and click an empty space, it inverts your selection, or inverts your mask, and so we can bring the lips up. And so, like if you want to close the character's mouth, easily done. Control, click and drag in empty space will get out of that mode, or will remove your mask. Okay, so those are some basic techniques for creating a model inside of ZBrush. We went through it a little bit quickly, and there's still a lot to learn in ZBrush. Again, I highly recommend you checking out some of the tutorials that already exist out there. Just as a quick example, up here underneath your tools, this is where you're basically working. If you click on something else, it's going to switch over to that tool. You can also do something like import, and import like an OBJ, a Maya file, a mesh file, and so forth. In other tutorials, we'll go over better ways of dealing with those things. But you can also load a tool if you wanted to, and say load up a monk. And this thing. Okay, and there he is. That's a quick monk that I did as a test scene. Again, just like when I was just as a quick sketch. I mean, it took me maybe about 5-10 minutes with this method. And if I wanted to, I could keep on extending his body to using Dynamesh to create a full character. It's really amazing how free this technique makes you. So from here, what you can do is you can start dropping in multiple heads or comparisons, or just basically have different models to work on at any one time. Okay. From here, the topology is pretty poor. Okay, it serves its purpose within ZBrush. From this point on, what you would end up doing is you'd end up tessellating the mesh higher, sculpting more precise details, getting things to be a little bit sharper, a little bit cleaner. You would also take this mesh, export it, or retopologize it inside of ZBrush or another package to get the topology that you want. A nice edge flow, something that is more in line with the final purpose of this object. If the final purpose is basically just what you see here, no need to go any further. But say, for example, you wanted to do a 3D print of this or rapid prototype of this. This is one area where, again, Dynamesh just rocks. What you can do is you can go and say insert cylinder, and we'll just click and drag. Oops, up. We have multiple subdivision levels here, so we're just going to reconstruct our Dynamesh, which gets rid of all of our subdivision levels. We'll go into that in another tutorial, but here just click and drag a mesh that defines kind of like an opening at the base. This is going to be our opening for shelling out this entire character. We can take this and we can move this around so it's placed in a slightly better location. Then underneath Dynamesh, you can create a shell. And this is something that I found to be very, very cool. And so we do that by first clearing the mask and then going up to create shell. Oops. Okay, so I kind of need to go over into draw, and then I'm probably going to have to create this submesh again. So I'm going to back up. Okay, so yeah, just need to do this properly here. If you use the insert cylinder, if you go to the bottom of your model, hold down Alt, and then click and drag on it, it's going to create a negative instance or a negative shape, a negative insert, which means basically subtraction. You can then use a move, rotate, and scale. And we're going to be going over a lot of these in more detail later on. Just to position this, go back to your draw mode, clear your mask so that's no longer there, and then click on create shell. And you can see that it went through and recreated it. And then look on the inside. It basically created a shell of a given thickness throughout the entire object. This is awesome for rapid prototyping, casting, all kinds of purposes. So just another awesome feature of Dynamesh. Okay, so that'll basically do it for this tutorial. In the next ones, we're going to be going over more sculpting tools and abilities. But this should be a great start for many people. And actually, it's one of those things that, the Dynamesh really just lowers the entry level. It makes it a lot easier to get into a package like ZBrush because you no longer have to worry about planning out your object ahead of time. You can just get in, start modifying things, start moving them around and defining the shape and the form that you want. And then once you know that, then you can sculpt in more detail, you can export, you can retopologize, texture, do all these other things. So in the next tutorials, we're going to be taking a look at more geometry, getting into some layers as well. Thanks for watching. Hope it helped in some way.